It certainly is reminiscent of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we frequently would pick up someone that we were convinced was a Soviet agent. Most of the time they were, but not always, and essentially use them as trading material so that someone that the Soviets had picked up could be freed in some sort of exchange. I don't know if that's the case this time around, but perhaps it is. But the thing to keep in mind is that this Wall Street Journal is very anti Russian and extremely neoconservative in its outlook. It certainly doesn't bear any resemblance to the Wall Street Journal I grew up with. And as a result, they're not very sympathetic to the Wall Street Journal and its owners. And of course, the owner is Rupert Murdoch. And I don't know that anyone has said anything about it other than I think Tucker mentioned it on his program that this man had been apprehended. Now, he was a long, long way from Moscow. And I have no idea what he was doing. He was within striking distance of some Russian military installation. And theoretically, he was trying to write a story on what the impact was on Russia of the war and whether or not its industries were actually producing and so forth. Whatever was the case, he was picked up. And I don't think the Russians are going to be very sympathetic.
Do the Russians respect journalistic rights? Does he have some sort of immunity because he's a bona fide journalist for a bona fide American media outlet, albeit one that is anti-Russian?
Well, you can be a bona fide Russian journalist with all the right credentials. And if you are seen photographing or visiting Virginia, say in the vicinity of Norfolk, and we are in a state of war, I think we would pick the man up. See, the thing that has to be borne in mind is the Russians are at war. And under those circumstances, it's very foolish to go near any military installation. And that's why I say if we were at war and we saw people nosing around submarine pens up in Puget Sound or a large Air Force base in Florida, we would pick them up right away.
So Jack Devine, and we'll run a clip from him a little later on, says that the Central Intelligence Agency does not use American journalists to do its dirty work, only foreign journalists. Is it inconceivable that Mr. Hershkowitz was working for American intelligence?
You know, I simply don't know. What I do know is that he would probably willingly turn over any information he found to the CIA because he's very hostile to Russia, just as the CIA is doing everything in its power to keep this operation going in any way, shape, or form it can. It's trying to shape domestic opinion. We know that. It creates the narratives that are widespread inside the United States on everything right now connected to Russia. So does he work for them? In theory, no. Does that make any difference under the circumstances? Again, Russia is at war. This is an American journalist. He is somewhere close to or en route to a Russian military installation. He's going to get picked up.
Got it. What is the status of all of the tanks that everybody was all agog about a month or so ago? The German Leopards and the American Abrams. Have they arrived? Are they on their way there? What is the likelihood that they will tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Ukrainians?
Well, as far as I know, the numbers of American M1 series tanks have not arrived. I don't know when they're going to show up, but they're certainly in the process of being readied for, use by the Ukrainians. The Leopards have shown up, as have some of the other pieces of equipment, and of course the Bradleys. They're not really tanks. That's an armored fighting vehicle, but it does have a 25 millimeter chain gun on it that's very lethal. I don't know if they also are going to equip them with TOW missiles. That's also a lethal missile under the right circumstances. I think what people are discovering is that the Russians have a number of missiles. One of them is called the Coronet. And this Coronet missile can be fired from 5,000 meters away or potentially even further. It's self-guiding. Once you sight the target, you can essentially fire and forget it. And if that warhead reaches a tank, any tank, it will destroy the tank. It doesn't make any difference what it is. So that that is something that I guess people are now beginning to notice because the Coronet missiles were used against Leopard tanks in Syria. And people should be very concerned about that. Again, this is something I think other analysts have said. It's not an individual weapon system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30 millimeter automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you'd probably need a couple of hundred of them on the battlefield just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some sort of a weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It can be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit.
Right.
If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. Okay. Secondly, we don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that can be integrated into future armored fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the U.S. military, and they may or may not be, I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield. And it robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's sort of like World War I, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery, and mines, and barbed wire and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world, 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right. And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months, but now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is that Sorovikin, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating,
right,
decided to turn Bakhmut into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmut partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it that could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason. Because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting. if that's what you're operating on, you're just doing what your enemy wants you to do. And I think Surovikin was the man behind that, and that's effectively what Prigozhin said. Now they say that all but a few blocks, something like 11% of the sort of built-up area of Bakhmut is absolutely devoid of Ukrainians, but there's still some left on the edge. And you still have talk, as we talked about the last time when we put the map up. You still have talks of 80,000 troops breaking through in or around or near Bakhmut in some fashion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but there's still a lot of talk about that. So perhaps you leave the door open one more month and let more people, essentially convert themselves into corpses by going in there.
We just interviewed Jack Devine just about a half an hour ago, and he had some comments about the Russians in Bakhmut that either will affect your blood pressure or cause you to have some fun with them. Here's what he said.
In the last 2 months, you were telling me these great wizards of the war were saying the Russians have the 300,000 man army and they're going to roll right over Ukraine. Here we are, 150,000 troops went in, and they may or may not have taken a town. I mean, he is having a hard time. This is not victory. Anybody that thinks he's won something, God bless you. But I mean, I don't know how I could hold my head and invade a country and move a few kilometers, So I think he's in trouble. I think he's in serious trouble. That's why there's a fight between the regular military and the Wagner group.
He, of course, to whom he refers is President Putin.
Well, Judge, what do you want me to say? I think Jack is entertaining to listen to, but I think he's got a severe problem with cranial rectal defilade. Thanks, Jack, for your interest in national defense. The other thing I would say is, and this is something else that people aren't paying attention to, but they should right now, the bridges over the Dnieper up in Zaporizhia and further north. These are major bridges that you can drive, 18-wheelers, tanks, anything you want across these bridges over that river. They're all intact.
Mm.
And the Russian citizenry has asked several times, why don't you destroy these and stop those Ukrainians from crossing that river? Well, the Ukrainians aren't crossing the river in very great strength anymore because they've killed most of them. They're trying to put together this big counterattack. We'll see what comes of it. I have serious doubts that it's going to amount to much. I think it's just going to get a lot of people killed. So why haven't they destroyed those bridges, Judge? Is it Jack Devine's perception that, the Russians just aren't very bright? They haven't done their battlefield assessment. They're not acting. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Russians plan to use those bridges
themselves. I mean, what prompted the ridiculous comments from Jack was my inquiry about Bakhmut falling. And first he denied it, and then he said he had heard the rumors that it fell, and then he said it's just one little town. Well, you and I and the thousands that watch us when you're on this show looked at the map and saw how central and how critical that town is. And now you've told us that the Russian strategy has not only been to secure the town, but to use it as the jaws of death, if I may, for the Ukrainian troops that were foolish enough to be flooded into those jaws.
Well, Ukrainian commanders, we know, have begged Zelensky to let them get out. They described it exactly as it is, a meat grinder. They were just losing people. We've been through these discussions. The average lifespan for someone new to the front is 4 hours? This is insane. So I think the Ukrainians knew that. The larger issue, and Jack is basically giving you the standard narrative, and that's fine.
Right.
And everybody's doing that in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Every once in a while, a little bit of truth creeps in. But the bottom line is that no one is moving a lot anywhere until the mud goes away. And, you try to explain to Americans that this stuff is like slogging your way through 10 feet of slime that sticks everything, that stops everything. Americans can't even begin to imagine it. The only place I've seen in the United States we come close to it is in southern Texas, where you have something they call caliche. It's a real thick earth that becomes mud and does something similar, but even it pales before what we're dealing with in.
Is this unique to Ukraine? And is this possibly what makes the Ukraine earth, dirt, so fertile for growing wheat?
No, I think so. I think when you're talking about what 10 to 15 meters deep in most places, this black earth, it's very rich, that will grow anything.
Right.
Throw anything in it, it grows.
When the Ukrainian military superiors are foolish enough to send their troops into a meat grinder or the jaws of death, does American intel know about this, even military intel? And are they warned about it? Or do the Ukrainians do it anyway because of this vain effort to die fighting?
Well, now you're moving into an area where we just don't know. I mean, I'm sure some of your former intelligence officers that you've spoken to can give you a better picture. My experience is that, first of all, if you've already decided what the outcome is going to be, which is the case in Washington, that Russia is going to be defeated, humiliated, and driven east out of Ukraine forever and ultimately capitulate and give up Crimea, if you believe that, then a whole lot of things don't work well. And one of those is that you may just ignore what comes up to you that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas. That's always been a problem. We went through that in Vietnam for years.
This morning in Moscow, President Putin addressed publicly the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. There were other Western ambassadors there as well. And he basically blamed the war on the United States and articulated in public his view, a view you and I share, and most people watching us now share, I think, that the U.S. was responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, the so-called color revolution. And the U.S. started all of this and thus is largely responsible for it. I don't know that President Putin has been that direct, that public about this before.
Well, I think he certainly made the larger case. He hasn't been specific about the so-called coup, but there's a huge mountain of evidence to support what he's saying. And by the way, you now have Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, who is absolutely convinced that we're running a quote unquote color revolution against him and his government.
Well, you're a question ahead of me as to whether, God bless you, Colonel, whether you believe that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for massive, persistent, endless demonstrations in the streets in Jerusalem and Israel over the makeup of the Israeli judiciary.
Well, you have this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy that is all over the place. And the National Endowment for Democracy should probably be renamed Color Revolution Headquarters for the subversion and installation of new governments that are subservient to, responsive to U.S. will. I mean, that was clearly going on in Kazakhstan in the first few weeks of this Ukrainian disaster. You'll recall the Russians sent a lot of special forces in there to help the government recover itself. It's been the case in any number of places. I think that's one of the reasons that Lukashenko has effectively signed on 100% for Putin, because you had the same outfit working in Minsk.
Right.
This is not new. Now, is the CIA involved with that? Of course.
Right. How else could it have happened? Well, President Putin was speaking directly into the eyes of the American ambassador in Moscow. President Zelensky was visiting one of his staunchest allies in Poland. We have a little clip there. There's the president of Poland, and there's President Zelensky. What more can the Poles give him short of troops on the ground, which we know is what he wants?
Well, now we've got another problem in the region. All of these, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of the states in Central East Europe that border Russia or are close to it in any way have agendas. We've got to remember that Poland after World War I, regained much of its territory that it had lost in the 1790s. It would like to do the same thing again. Remember that Stalin's great gift to the Europeans was to shove millions of Germans further west, then shove millions of Poles into places that were historically German, at least for 1,000 years. And this had a wonderful effect because it forced the Germans away from Russia, but it also created in Stalin's mind permanent conditions of hostility between the Germans and the Poles for the territorial changes that he imposed on them.
Right.
Hungary lost vast territory at the end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
They controlled vast lands that are now occupied by the Romanians. Some are occupied by the Serbs. Some are occupied today by Croats. Some are occupied by Slovaks. So you go back into these countries and you begin to talk to people, and just because you lost a war, just because you weren't on the winning side 100 years ago, you have to understand these people. They were dominant powers for centuries, dominant not just in economic or military terms, but also culturally, linguistically. You get the same thing when you go to Iran. You know, very few people understand that from the Chinese border all the way to the border with Russia and Ukraine, the language that was spoken on the so-called Silk Road was Persian.
All right. Well, while we're talking about cultural, are there cultural rumblings now in Kosovo?
Yes. Yeah, that's another terrible wound. It's another example of where we intervened. We created an artificial construct that was forced into existence that otherwise would never have been tolerated in the region. Remember,
Yugoslavia?
Yeah. Well, remember that Yugoslavia fell apart. That too was inevitable because the majority of people that were Roman Catholics or Muslim certainly did not want to live under Orthodox Christian Serbs. You know, that's another gift from World War I. It was a dumb idea. We're going to force people that have been either allied or ruled by Catholic Germans for 1,000 years into the arms of Christian Orthodox Serbs. It's crazy. Well, we did it. So that fell apart. And then we decided, well, all of these people must be compelled to live together in the new multicultural, multinational, multi, whatever it is, paradise that we in Washington are creating. And the whole world will learn this is the way it must be. Well, this is all nonsense. Kosovo is part of Serbia and has been part of Serbia for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They lost it a couple of times and they regained it. And they fought very hard during the Balkan Wars to get it away from the Ottoman Turks. If you're Greek, if you're a Bulgarian, if you're Romanian, if you are Serbian, the presence of large Muslim populations that were essentially created by the Turks and separate governments and institutions that were installed by the Turks, they're very uncomfortable with this. And given what we experienced in 2001, you can imagine the paranoia flag went to full mast. It's still there. So Islamist terrorism, Islamist assassination programs, gangsterism, call it what you will, is run out of Kosovo to a large extent. It's a clearinghouse. A lot of those missing weapons from Ukraine show up in Kosovo and end up going to North Africa, down into the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere.
Didn't we bomb the daylights out of Kosovo in the Clinton administration?
Well,
Mrs. Albright wanted sort of an American-controlled caliphate.
Yeah, well, that's largely it. You've got to go back to Albright and Al Gore, Sandy Berger, Strobe Talbot. These are all figures in the church of moralizing globalism, and they wanted to create this new paradise. And so we bombed them for 78 days. And of course, this had a hugely negative impact on all the Orthodox Christians that live in the region, because from their standpoint, we're backing an Islamist element in their neighborhood that they personally revile and detest. And we're doing it at the expense of Orthodox Christians. I mean, in that part of the world, you cannot be everyone's friend. If you side with anybody, you become instantly enemies for everybody else.
Of course.
And then we created this mess, and this mess is gradually beginning to unravel.
at the same time that we just the president just authorized another 2.58 billion today in military equipment to be shipped to Ukraine. He has no off ramp, Colonel.
No, that's
no political off ramp, no moral off ramp. He doesn't possess a moral off ramp. I don't know how this is going to end. What do you see happening in the next 6 months?
Well, remember from their vantage point, and I'm talking about the people in power in Washington. This includes most of the people who sit in the Senate and the House.
Right.
If you oppose our policy, you are by definition evil. So that anything that we do to you is justified. This is the unfortunate situation. We demonized the Serbs and treated them as though they were all war criminals. We're doing the same thing to the Russians. It's all going to end badly for us. But I think the most likely scenario is financial crisis followed by economic downturn that will drive us out of Ukraine. That's the only way I see us leaving. Unless, of course, some of these governments in Europe turn over. And remember, the situation in Europe, certainly from an economic standpoint, is in many cases much worse. I mean, I've got all these.
I think the governments in France and Germany are very tenuous at this point.
No, I think so. And you could see those governments change. And the average German on the street doesn't want anything to do with the war against Russia in Ukraine. The average German says, why haven't we negotiated an end to this? Why have we behaved as a vassal state for America? I mean, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, people said, well, we have to be good NATO members. That's going away. People are saying, wait a minute, the cost of eggs for a dozen eggs is through the roof. We can't get get the things that we need and want.
Last question. How crazy is it in the midst of this war to double the size of the Russian NATO border by adding Finland in the midst of this war? What do they expect President Putin to do?
Well, I think the Finns know that Putin is not going to do anything because he doesn't feel threatened by Finland, and he doesn't understand why the Finns have done this because the Finns haven't felt threatened by Russia. It's a very strange set of circumstances. The Russians have no interest in going to war with the Finns and vice versa. But what we have tried to do is eliminate neutrality as a solution.
Right.
And that's unfortunate. I'm surprised that we're not also trying to force the Austrians into joining NATO. I don't think that would go well, though, right now, because as we know, when Mr. Zelensky spoke to the Austrian parliament, pictures were altered, I guess. One was supposed to be used for a speaker on some sort of stereo system. I don't know what the other one was for, but they were given as gifts by a Ukrainian chief of police to the Polish chief of police with the hope of cultivating closer ties and cooperation. Somewhere along the line, the Ukrainians seem to think it happened after they sent it off to him, and that may well be true. I have no idea. A live grenade was found in this thing, and it accidentally or purposely exploded. We don't know, but it's a very hard to imagine how something like this could have crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland without being detected. I'm sure the Polish chief of police wasn't hiding anything.
How would this have been delivered? Not through the mail.
Well, I don't know. The sad part here is that you're well aware, as many of us are, that there's this long history of antagonism between the Poles and the Ukrainians. So this opens up that whole ugly chapter for discussion. Was this intentional, or was this in fact an accident? Nobody is able to answer it, except that right now the facts are what I sent to you on email, and that's all we know.
What were the injuries to the Polish commander? Do we know?
Apparently none. He had maybe modest scratches or something, but no serious injuries of any kind were reported.
Okay. Do we still have a president of Poland beating the drum and acting as if his troops are going to get engaged? I think we do. Do we not?
Yes. Well, in the op-ed that I just finished that the American Conservative will have out tomorrow, I lead with the remarks of the Deputy Polish Minister of Defense, who is warning an audience on the 29th of November that this war is growing in intensity and Poland is likely to be involved in it, and hints at potential mobilization, a number of other things down the line. Now, since then, we've also had a source tell us that the Polish government is now looking at 200,000 troops that could be mobilized next year. All of this is disconcerting because, remember, inside the NATO alliance, Poland is really alone in its enthusiasm for aggressive war against Russia. Nobody else, with the possible exception of the Romanians, is interested.
Well, your piece is a scary one, Colonel. I mean, you start by summarizing the interview. We talked about this before, but we'll touch on it again. That General Zaluzhny had with The Economist magazine, and when he asks for 300 new tanks and 600 to 700 new infantry fighting vehicles and 500 new howitzers, you conclude he's not asking for assistance. He's asking for a new army. And he must know that this is not possible.
Well, one would think so. And I think they were trying to set the stage for a meeting with the United States in which they would get more other types of assistance, potentially convince us and maybe others in this so-called coalition of the willing to intervene and help them in some way. That's why I find it extremely disturbing. Because President Biden has said from the beginning that we were not going to directly engage the Russians in a military confrontation. Yet we seem to be moving closer to that outcome. And the Poles, of course, I think would actually welcome that, which is very dangerous. You know, this is the problem when you ally yourself with a relatively small state. The small state has a permanent interest in leveraging your power for their benefit.
Right, right. You point out that Ukraine hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity, and Ukraine with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers. How many healthy soldiers do they have remaining? Do you know?
Well, the last word that I had was they had 194,000 quote unquote effectives. And in the article, Zaluzhny mentions that he's got 200,000 combat ready troops, people that can fight. He has another 500,000 people in uniform, but they're not necessarily soldiers. They may be police, paramilitary, other kinds of functionaries, but they're not fit for frontline duty. And I think that's a huge admission because it also tells you something about the enormous number of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking.
Why is General Zaluzhny saying all this in public? Is there some purpose or goal to this?
Yeah, I think, again, he and President Zelensky know what I know and know what anybody knows who looks carefully at the assembling Russian force and its enormous firepower, standoff attack and direct firepower. And he's being honest. He's saying, well, their attacks could be stronger than we think, and we could be weaker than we thought later on in the article. In other words, it's a backhanded way of saying, look, this is very dangerous. We probably are not going to succeed against this kind of force. We've asked you for more. What are you going to do? In other words, the ball is in your court, Washington. And after all, we urged them to fight from the beginning. We've never come back and said, well, there's a point at which it makes no sense to fight on.
Would it be fair to characterize General Zaluzhny as the realist and President Zelensky as sort of has pipe dreams? And would it be fair to say that the Russians have far more respect for the general than they do for the president?
Well, first of all, I have no idea, but I suspect that Zaluzhny, who's been on the phone before with his counterpart in Moscow, has at least a rapport with the Russians. What that is and how well that goes, I can't evaluate, but they have talked. And I think Zaluzhny is being realistic and as open as he can. And Zelensky is permanently cheerleader for the war in perpetuity and has sold himself as Washington's man on the ground to lead the charge against Moscow. I don't think he can back down from that. He's made so many sweeping statements that are so ridiculous that he can't retreat.
Is it conceivable that General Zaluzhny would work out some peace agreement with the Russians in order to save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, no matter what President Zelensky thinks about it, almost sort of pushing him out of the way. He's got the pipeline to Moscow. Nobody in Moscow will say a word to President Zelensky.
Judge, we're now in the realm that I would comfortably call the Twilight Zone.
All right.
Who knows? I mean, we could sit here and speculate about that, but I think there are lots of people that are willing to pull out their weapons and shoot people down right now inside Kiev in the government who might go that route. I think that they're stuck. They're going to fight. And perhaps in the midst of this fighting, there will be a call for some sort of ceasefire. And again, the problem is you're dealing now with a Russian government that has given up on the West.
Let's move from the East all the way to the West. Does General Zaluzhny have respect at the Pentagon? Does he have the ear of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, or of Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin, somebody who can get to the president on the phone in a few minutes?
I'm sure that he probably has a line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and potentially the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And remember, we've been down this road before with Milley. He leaked his rejected advice to the president to the New York Times when he said Ukrainians have done about as much as they can and they should negotiate. And that was rejected. And he was sent back out to recant and effectively sing the tune of inevitable Ukrainian victory. So at this point in time, even if he has a direct line, the man in charge is sitting in the White House. And I'm sure that no one in this administration at this stage wants to admit that they made a terrible mistake and put Ukraine's very existence at risk.
Your greatest fear, and stop me if I don't have this right, is that the man in the White House will pull an LBJ. And when his generals, when Westmoreland said to LBJ, we're going to lose unless we don't have another 125,000 troops, LBJ said, you got them. I don't know that Zaluzhny would say that to Biden, but what's to prevent Biden from saying, I'm using your language, Colonel, you wrote this, it's brilliant. By the way, for those listening to us, it's called Downfall in Kyiv and Washington, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And it'll be available tomorrow at the American Conservative at their website. Colonel, your fear is that Joe Biden wants to lead a coalition of the willing, which is to be about 2 or 3 NATO countries.
Yes, I think that the people in Washington, and when I say people, I'm talking about virtually everybody inside the Beltway, has all drunk heavily from the Kool-Aid that says Russia is weak, Russia is incompetent, the soldiers are no good, the army is weak, we can prevail. We have to stay the course with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can still outfight them. And if we need to go in to bolster the Ukrainians and try to establish under the guise of a no-fly zone on the ground, some sort of secure area in western Ukraine, down near the Polish border, in order to provide a safe haven for retreating Ukrainian forces or refugees or something else, we should do that because we can still dominate the Russians if we need to. And that was, see, LBJ knew that he had enormous leverage with the United States Navy and Air Force, not just our ground forces over North Vietnam. We have no such leverage over the Russians. This is a pure continental land combat, and they hold all the trump cards. And we have very few forces, and we're depending very heavily, if we go in there, on the Poles. And while the Poles are very brave, courageous soldiers, that's an irrational act on the part of an American.
I mean, what coalition would there be? Who besides Poland and Romania would be in Joe Biden's army and America, of course?
Well, I'm sure you'd have some British Special Operations Forces. Beyond that, who knows? I mean, the rest of NATO really doesn't have much to send. I mean, the force that was described in the interview that Zaluzhny asked for is larger than any of the armies in Europe. So what are they going to send? And the answer is, I don't think they have much to send at all. And now they've already exhausted most of their supplies of ammunition and weapons. They've sent most of that excess that's either now in Russian hands and some of it is still with the Ukrainians. But the Russians have captured a lot of equipment, destroyed a lot of equipment.
One of our regular guests is an American named Matthew Van Dyke. Matt is the head of Sons of Liberty International, which he describes as all ex-military. These guys are young. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s, who believe in the Ukrainian cause, who wear military fatigues, who are physically present on the ground. I don't know if they carry weapons. They don't shoot. They're not close to where people are shooting or being shot at. They're training Ukrainians. Matt sent out a rather startling tweet just a few minutes ago. Here it is. Ukraine must conduct a major offensive now. Ukraine has the advantage this winter in morale and logistics. Russia will recover by spring and will never be this weak again. The next 2 months are critical in this war. Don't dig in, advance. Now, I don't know if you know this fellow. He's a young man. He's on with us regularly. This is the first time I've heard him say anything like this. Russia will recover by spring. What do you think about this?
It sounds to me like some of the ideas that were hatched by Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944 for offensives in the East when there was no capability whatsoever for offensive action in the German army. Sounds to me like his thinking behind the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army couldn't fuel itself 100 kilometers without falling apart. So I'm sure the man is very sincere and believes in what he's saying, but I think he's dead wrong. And there's not a whole lot for the Russians to do between now and the end of January for them to be ready. I think they're very close to it.
I want to go back to General Zaluzhny before I ask you about President Putin in Belarus. I want to make sure I understand the numbers. General Zaluzhny has about 190,000 troops, and then he has 200,000 trained troops and reserves. So if he wants, he has about 400,000 troops. Do I have those numbers right?
Well, he actually gave, and again, I don't know that these numbers are trustworthy. Much of what comes out of Kyiv has never been trustworthy. So take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but it's Zaluzhny who has a reputation for being truthful, no?
No. None of the Ukrainians have been truthful about the conduct of this war. They've lied prolifically about everything. And he's saying they have 700,000, 200,000 in that category of fit to fight, trained combat troops, and then 500,000 of others, police, paramilitary. And so forth. Now, again, I have no idea what's going on. I do know that the Nazi enforcers are brutalizing people, forcing them into uniform, sending them to the front.
These are Ukrainian Nazi enforcers forcing young men, able-bodied or not, into Ukrainian military uniforms.
Yeah, they're sending press gangs through Kiev and other cities at nightclubs, night spots, to see if they can find young men who may be there, and then pressing them into service. Sort of what the Royal Navy did in the 19th century and the 18th century to keep the ships filled. So that's why I say I'm sure that Matt's sincere. And I do know that if you ask Ukrainian soldiers, they do speak very confidently of their future as though they have a chance to really win. And you heard that from German soldiers right up until March of 1945.
Oof.
So I don't think that we should take that very seriously.
I would imagine that President Zelensky's people are aggressively controlling the media and what the Ukrainian troops and what their families back home hear.
Well, I'm sure they are too, but he doesn't have to work too hard to control the Western media. That's already in his camp.
Already his. Yeah, the CIA has done that for him. Yeah. All right, back to numbers available. What does President Putin have available? Is it 300,000 that are about to add to the fighting force that's there now?
No, the numbers once again that were given were misleading. He said, well, he has 200,000 fresh combat troops, probably more than that. You know, I said a few weeks ago that the numbers by January could go up to 700,000.
Russian numbers.
Russian numbers. And you just divide that roughly in half because about half of that falls into logistics and standoff attack and fire support. The rest of it are attacking forces that go in on the ground to kill the enemy. So I think the Russians are, quite frankly, already outnumber their opponents dramatically. And they have been training very, very hard. Now, you have to add to that number probably 75,000 Belarusian troops. And Putin, of course, is up in Belarus right now.
Right now, what is he doing in Belarus? Belarus is another country, former Soviet satellite, but now a separate independent country.
Yes, but they are fully allied with Russia.
Okay.
And Belarus is going to provide whatever is required or necessary for the Russian forces in their country to launch attacks against Ukraine. As I said, there's 75,000 in that army, and most of that is deployed along the border with Lithuania and Poland. But they have a secure base of support in Belarus for at least 100, 150,000 troops attacking north to south.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of the most as I listen to you and our friend Scott Ritter, and as I read the media available to me, is that the president of Poland is crazy. And he's very, very anxious to begin a conflagration that historians will one day call World War III.
Well, that's again going back to the discussion earlier about a small state ultimately leveraging a large one.
Right. Will Joe Biden, who could get into Biden's head? Will pressure be put on Joe Biden, whether it's from the Pentagon or the globalists, to back Poland up?
Oh, I think that that's very much in people's minds right now, that Poland is the springboard against Russia, and that we should be prepared to use that in order to rescue Ukraine from inevitable destruction. That's why I wrote the article, because I'm afraid that we'll suddenly hear from Joe Biden on the television. Tonight, my fellow Americans, I've directed our forces to advance into Western Ukraine to provide a safe haven or something, a secure zone in Western Ukraine. And it's about peace, democracy, and freedom, all of which has got nothing to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what we said about Vietnam. Only this time, you're not talking about Vietnam, you're talking about Russia, a great power.
If he does that, the Congress will do nothing. The Congress will do nothing. The president of the United States can't start a war on his own. I'm familiar with the War Powers Resolution. I think it's unconstitutional, but it is the law. But this will fall right into the hands of the globalists. And we know their goal: to remove President Putin from power, whether by embarrassment and humiliation or death.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that people understand the meaning of what I've said in that op-ed, that whatever is said to justify a potential intervention by us in the western part of Ukraine should be dismissed out of hand as dangerous nonsense. The opportunity to do things differently ended a long time ago. If people were serious about trying to prevent the Russians from moving into Ukraine or deterring them from going any further than a few kilometers, we had that back in February, March, and April. We could have sent vast forces over there very, very quickly. Well, of course we didn't. And Judge, we didn't do it because they're not ready. And we don't have ready forces now for a stand-up war in Eastern Europe. So this is all dangerous nonsense.
Where is General Milley on this? I mean, what General Milley leaked was a truthful analysis of the situation. Then they made him do the mea culpa. So when that happens, I mean, the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they must know that Milley is a realist. They can get him to mouth their words, but when they ask for his advice, I assume he's telling them what he truly thinks we should do, which is to get the hell out.
Well, on this occasion, I think he has told them the truth behind closed doors, that we should not involve ourselves in this. It's too risky. We don't have the forces for it. We don't have the logistical infrastructure. We don't have the ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. But he's not someone who is noted throughout his career for standing up for much of anything.
Do we have 4 stars in Europe right now?
Yes, you have a 4-star at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
And who's in charge of the 40,000 American troops in Poland?
Well, I don't know. That could be the 5th Corps commander. The 5th Corps has a headquarters over there right now from Fort Hood. Potentially. I don't know what the exact command relationships are, but you've got 3 stars, you've got a 4-star, and then you have several 2 stars. Really very top heavy for a force that's only about 45,000
Were
troops.
those 45,000 trained, ready, and prepared to march? God forbid, I'm even saying this, to march east?
Well, I think they're prepared to defend the Polish border. I don't think they're prepared to advance into Western Ukraine and confront an enemy like the Russians. But again, I hold the minority opinion. Remember, I told you at the beginning, you go into Washington and everybody's absolutely not, Judge. And
now, if I were to put that question to General David Petraeus, how do you think he might answer that in light of his public comments in the last week?
Well, I suppose you'd have to call all the people that helped to promote him, who are currently sitting in positions of authority in Washington, before he gave you an answer, to ensure that whatever he said was what they wanted him to say.
Okay, and you're not
one of the things I think you and your audience can appreciate is this. In 1942, after the fall of Tobruk, June-July timeframe of 1942, the British had been through 2 long years of uninterrupted defeats at the hands of the Germans. And remember, in almost every encounter, the British and their allies outnumbered the Germans. And finally, after Tobruk fell, which was a very major blow in North Africa, someone asked Churchill, well, are we losing this war? We haven't won any battles. He said, I know battles are important, but battles don't necessarily decide wars. He said, in modern warfare, it's the trends in the wars that decide them. And the trends ultimately favor us, not the Germans. Be patient. Well, I think Churchill was right. The Russians have not sustained any serious defeats. And we know that they were off to a slow start for all the reasons that we've covered. Where they are right now is, frankly, where they want to be. They are defending the territory that they've annexed, and they are training, preparing, and organizing for the major offensives to come in November and December. And here's something else that your audience may find of interest. The 300,000 man mobilization is over, in the sense that those 300,000 reservists are now inside the Russian armed forces, and they're integrated and they're being prepped, trained, whatever you want to call it. But the mobilization has not been suspended. And there's a lot of evidence that decisions behind the scenes have been made to continue mobilizing, so that instead of looking at 700,000 troops, Russian troops in November, December timeframe, we may be looking at 1 million in the field before January. And I think this is because Mr. Putin and his national security advisors, his military commanders, are listening to us and the threats that we continue to make, and the insistence that he effectively surrender to Mr. Zelensky. And that's not going to happen.
Among those threats, and the reason, of course, for my reference to General David Petraeus in an earlier question, is, of course, a public comment that General Petraeus made, in which he said the United States and some NATO countries should lead some sort of an allied force, not a NATO force, but some sort of a coalition of the willing, to quote George W. Bush, on the ground in Ukraine against the Russians. And knowing Petraeus, as I know you do, I'm sure you know that he wouldn't have said something like that without having run it up the flagpole first. So first, what do you think militarily of what General Petraeus has offered? And secondly, who, since he's a civilian now, up the flagpole would he have run this past? Who else wants this? Does the Secretary of State actually expect his boss, the President of the United States, whose administration is tottering on the brink and whose physical existence is tottering on the brink, to put American troops on the ground? I'm asking you a lot all at once. I'll let you take those balls and run with them.
Well, on the first question, I think we have to regard this as having been a kind of trial balloon. In other words, Petraeus was given this material and told to run with it because the people in Washington are interested to see or hear what kind of a response, if any, they get from the American people. That's the first thing. Secondly, unfortunately, I do think there is serious planning going on about the use of U.S. forces in Ukraine. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's ill-conceived, but it's going on. Third, the mention of a coalition of the willing is a dead giveaway because NATO is not united on this issue. Most people in Europe are not interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. So when you ask the question, what is this coalition of the willing? Well, are we going to get some Romanian troops, Polish troops, perhaps, maybe some Lithuanians? It's hard to tell. Anybody else prepared to show up? I don't know how many British troops they can expect to get. I don't think the British could field 10 to 15,000 troops in any period of time that would be competent on the battlefield. The French, they're already overextended in Africa. So I don't know who else we're talking about. So this coalition of the willing, as it's termed, is another indicator. And then finally, why are we talking about this at all, Judge?
Right. Why? Because
Ukraine,
the globalists in the State Department want to put Putin out of business, and they think they can do it.
First, it's because Ukraine is devastated. It's losing. It's on the brink of extinction. The counterattacks that we saw over the last several months, it started out with 30, 40, 50,000 troops, then declined to perhaps 10,000, 12,000. They declined further to 3,000 to 5,000. And recently we've seen battalion-sized units, 500, 600, 700, actually trying to probe and walk through Russian defenses. They're running out of manpower that can fight. And in fact, the information I have is that the Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, and we don't know how many there are. I've heard lots of estimates all the way up to and a little bit above 10,000. And then the so-called Foreign Legion that Ukraine has fielded, which may number 5,000 to 7,000 or less. Again, we don't know. That those formations are the only formations with any stomach for a serious attack in a major fight. So that's the other point. Now, finally, to go to yours. Yes, Judge, we have people in Washington who want a direct confrontation with Russia because they believe they can bully Russia. They believe they can compel the Russians to submit, that Mr. Zelensky can show up and accept their surrender. It's bizarre. There's no evidence for it. It's dangerous. It's stupid. But yes, they are there. And I think that characterizes the thinking at the top of the administration.
So Zelensky, who was all over the place in the media for 7 or 8 months, really hasn't made two observations. Hasn't made very many public appearances in the past month. So I offer to you the thought that maybe he knows that what you're saying is truthful and his days are numbered. The other observation I want to make is the storied American 101st Airborne is in Europe for the first time since World War II. They're in Romania. What are they doing in Romania?
Well, according to the reports, there are about 5,000 of them. This is a mix of light infantry and UH-60 aircraft. I don't know if they have a battalion of H-64D attack helicopters with them, but they're supposedly working with Romanian forces. Again, this looks like one wing or one leg of the coalition of the willing. Then the rest of the division is up in Poland, which is several hundred miles north. And there are all sorts of rumors on the internet, and people are saying, oh, well, they're going to fly in to Odessa and set up a blocking position to prevent the Russians from moving on Odessa. And they'll be reinforced. Okay, I find it hard to believe that we would be quite that stupid, because Odessa is very definitely on the menu for the Russians. It's a Russian city, a Russian-speaking city. It's never been Ukrainian. And they are going to retake it, just as they're going to retake Kharkov for the same reasons. And that's probably where they would stop normally. But if this happens, I don't think the outcome will be a positive one for the United States and its coalition of the willing. And then, of course, the question is, if we sustain heavy casualties and we are seen as losing, are we then going to turn to nuclear weapons? Because as I've said repeatedly on this thing, I have never seen any interest on the Russian side in the use of a nuclear weapon. I've seen nothing to indicate it. The statements that have been made were always made in response to us, response to anyone who questioned whether the Russians would respond if they were attacked with a nuclear weapon. And they made it very clear that they will. And this is the problem with this limited nuclear war business. But I think now the danger is we could walk into this. And as I tried to point out in that short 1,000-word op-ed, we're not ready. This is sort of get set and go in whether you're ready or not. And we're not ready. The infrastructure isn't there. The tons of ammunition are not on hand. The force sizes don't make any sense. I mean, we keep saying, well, the Russians were stupid when they went in. They made all these mistakes. Well, the Russians at least went in there with a goal of not killing fellow Orthodox Slavs. That was a goal. Didn't want to kill them. All right, that didn't quite work out as they'd hoped. But now we're talking about going in, and we have no such guidelines or constraints, but we don't have the forces. And we're now saying, well, the Russians are building forces. Well, there's a reason for that. This place is the size of Texas. If you don't have several 100,000 troops, you're not going to be able to dominate it. How are we going to do this? I think it's insane.
Something else that you alluded to in your fascinating 1,000-word op-ed to which you just made reference was the War Powers Resolution. In my view, a profoundly unconstitutional piece of legislation, but it's never been tested in the courts. And it means that we could all wake up some morning to find Joe Biden on television saying, by the way, last night, 50,000 American troops entered the fray in the Ukraine war, and there's nothing the Congress or anybody could do about it for 90 days. Then he reports on it, and they can stay another 90 days. Then he needs congressional approval. But for half a year, for 180 days, he has, in my view, the constitutional power that Madison and company expressly reserved for the Congress in his own hands. He can choose the target and wage the war, which makes him a prince. Madison was adamant about separating war-making power from war-waging power, but this terrible piece of legislation, which President Nixon vetoed because he thought it crimped his style rather than expanding his power, another argument for another time, gives Joe Biden that authority. Is this something we have to fear, that we wake up some morning and find out that while we all slept, 50,000 uniformed American troops, I'm just throwing that number out, entered the Ukraine-Russian war?
Yes. I think it's a real possibility now, much more so than any kind of nuclear exchange. I still do not believe that anyone in the White House is deranged enough to even consider such a thing. But I do think that this is a possibility. How much is it? 90%, 80%, 60%? I don't know. But I do know that after I'd written that op-ed piece, I received an awful lot of information from people on the inside telling me that I was dead right and on target, and then beginning to tell me the kinds of things that were under consideration. So yes, I think it's a possibility. Now, if we go back to this whole business, let's face it, certainly since FDR, I think we've lived in a world of presidential government. And that's one of the tragedies of the United States. We were founded as
Agreed. There's no question about that the presidency, no matter who occupies it, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, or Harry Truman or Barack Obama, the presidency has expanded almost to the point of dictatorial powers. That George W. Bush and his successors all claim that somehow they can kill people. I mean, these are claims that even to FDR would have sounded alien. But I have heard nothing other than from you and our colleagues who've been critical of General Petraeus from his statement. Now, you say it may have been a trial balloon. Were they expecting tub thumping in support of it? Or were they expecting silence because no one wants to be the first one behind Petraeus to say it's time to put American troops in harm's way?
I think they're most interested to see if there is any public reaction. The people that govern in Washington are really accustomed to a quiescent, compliant public. I mean, how often do people take to the streets to object to things that we do overseas with the American military? The last time I remember any serious opposition to anything being done overseas was during the Vietnam War. And people say, well, see, that's because we had a draft. Not really. It took years before they finally went to the streets and objected to the Vietnam War. How long were we in Vietnam before anything happened? 3 years. Right. So the problem is that most Americans on any given day aren't interested. And so what you get as a consequence of this is what you have now. Right now, we have people at the top of this administration who are behaving like 3-year-old children who have found out that there are these things called electrical sockets, and they've got forks, and they're shoving forks into the electrical socket to see what happens. Well, one of them is going to be electrocuted, to be sure. Probably will be shocked by it at the least. That's where we are. That's what this idea of going into Ukraine is. It's dangerously stupid. You are pushing the fork into the electrical outlet.
Let's get back to the status of things on the ground. One of our viewers asks, isn't it true that Russia has lost territory? And if so, why? That is, lost territory that it had previously conquered and acquired.
Well, the only place that they have lost territory, as I understand it, that is significant in terms of square mileage was up near Kharkov. And that was an area where they only had 2,000 paramilitary police stiffened by some paratroopers. And they just said, look, this is wide open, flat terrain. It's not worth it. We can come back here whenever we want to. And they pulled out. The Ukrainians were then subject to punishing artillery, rocket fire, missiles, airstrikes, and lost 40% of the force that went in there. Now, over the last several weeks, we've had these little maneuvers, little attacks that for a while pushed forward, were then driven back. And what has been going on just within the last 24 hours is another one of those. But the real focus has been Kherson, which is critical to the Russians and critical to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been expending every effort they can to try and gain control of it. They haven't. And they haven't driven the Russians off the bridgehead that they have west of the Dnieper River. And I keep hearing people report that. So I always go back and check. And what we have seen is Russian civilians were understandably evacuated. That's a good thing. We don't want them to be killed, just as the Ukrainians ought to evacuate Ukrainian civilians to avoid their deaths. But there has been no massive withdrawal of Russian forces anywhere. And I would simply suggest that these modest gains here or there have generally been reversed. And if they haven't been reversed, it's because there's no urgency to do so. And remember, behind these front lines right now, most Americans don't know this, there are groups of Russian forces with the best equipment available of between 50 and 80,000 men training behind these lines down in southern Ukraine, also behind the lines up in western Russia or eastern Ukraine, and then up in Belarus. So it looks like we see the evidence for 3 major axes as a minimum emerging, involving hundreds of thousands of troops on the attack. That's their focus. They're not worried about a few kilometers here or there of open, flat terrain.
What is, if you know, what is life like in the formerly Ukrainian areas now under Russian control? Is this like when the Nazis entered Paris and somehow the SS was working with the Paris police, and somehow the SS found compliant French politicians to run the machinery of city government? So who runs government? Who runs the schools? And is there day-to-day normal life and commercial activities going on in these 4 regions that a year ago were subject to Kyiv and now are subject to Moscow?
Well, the areas that they're currently under Russian control have been given huge quantities of food, medicine, humanitarian assistance, which was badly needed. And there are large numbers of engineering organizations down there trying to rebuild many of the towns and villages and farms and so forth that were destroyed in the war. Since most of the people consider themselves to be Russian, I have not seen evidence for any friction, nor has any really been reported, and that includes reports by foreign journalists who are not Russians. So I don't think you can compare that with the Second World War. I mean, if we were talking about what was it like to be Polish, White Russian, or Ukrainian when the Soviet armies entered these countries as liberators, I can tell you from personal experience in large areas, people wanted the Germans to come back within 24 hours. So that's not what we're dealing with. This is a very different setting. And that's why reaching back to World War II all the time is a serious mistake. This is a very different set of circumstances. Beyond that, I can't report in any detail because I haven't been there.
How do you expect the winter will go? Next week is November, and soon heat will be a very serious problem, not just for the troops, but for people in their homes in Kyiv.
Well, unless Greta Thunberg can stop the onset of winter, I think it's going to be damn cold. And in that part of the world, having been in that part of the world, it's very cold in the winter. It's not.
Well, how about Berlin and Munich? How about major cities in Germany?
Well, of course, but those areas are going to get colder first. Remember, these are flat, open steppe, vast fields. So you don't have anything that holds in the heat. In other words, the cities are it. And most of the things that lie between the major cities are tiny villages and so forth. So there's nothing to hold the heat in. And the fuel is going to be a big problem for the Ukrainians. Right now, the Ukrainians are already withdrawing all of their armor because they don't have fuel for it. That is tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They're operating right now out of pickup trucks. That's what I referred to in the op-ed, the so-called technicals, where you put a heavy machine gun or an automatic cannon on a pickup truck. There's a reason for that. They don't have the fuel. The electrical grid is down, which means that the railways aren't working, except in those cases where the Ukrainians have diesel engines. Those diesel engines are being targeted, and I would expect the diesel engines to be destroyed very soon. So all the aspects of mobility that in a wide open space are so critical are being eliminated for the Ukrainians.
Well, Colonel, it's always a pleasure. No matter what we talk about, we'll hope you come back and join us again soon.
Well, let's hope that someone wakes up and sees the criticality of bringing this to an end, arranging peace talks. That's what's so desperately needed.
Okay, you just gave me a thought for another question before we part ways for the day. If Dave Petraeus picks up the phone and calls you, what are you going to say to him?